From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Reporting tonight from London.
Good evening. President Bush has left the Middle East and gone home, but all the fear and loathing of a region in crisis goes with him. The president spent today trying to keep two of the Middle East's most important political players comfortably in the anti-Iraqi coalition with him. He didn't have any difficulty in Egypt this morning with President Hosni Mubarak, but in Geneva this afternoon, Syria's Hafez al-Assad was a lot tougher. ABC's Britt Hume is with the president on the road.
As the cameras clicked during the photo opportunity at the start of their meeting, the two leaders looked like men who didn't know each other and didn't have much in common, which is what they are. They answered no questions. They met with their aides present for about 2 hours, then again with only their interpreters. When it was over, the president left Geneva without saying a word. An aide issued a brief statement portraying the two leaders as in general agreement on the Persian Gulf. In Cairo earlier today, the president called on Egyptian President Mubarak, who had strongly urged Mr. Bush to meet with Assad. At a news conference, Mubarak explained why.
President Assad has his forces now beside our forces and beside other Arab forces in Saudi Arabia for the purpose of liberating Kuwait. So we shouldn't neglect him. He's a very important partner there.
President Bush tried to keep the Assad meeting from suggesting any budding friendship with the Syrian, who has been identified as a sponsor of terrorism by Mr. Bush's own State Department.
We got big differences on certain categories, and I'll be glad to discuss them with the President Hafez Assad when I meet with him. And as long as I have one American troop, one man, one woman left there in the armed forces in this Gulf, I will continue to work closely with all those who stand up against this aggression.
Mr. Bush's claim of significant Arab support for his Gulf policy depends far more on Mubarak than on Assad. The Egyptian dispatched forces to the desert early and today strongly opposed any compromise with Saddam Hussein. And he suggested if it came to war, his troops would fight.
We send the forces there, and all of us know what will be the mission of the force. Whenever the use of force is needed, and this option is going to be implemented, we have to react.
And speaking of force, the UN next week is expected to begin debating a resolution authorizing its use to get Iraq out of Kuwait. The president said today he is, quote, very, very close to having the votes to pass it. Britt Hume, ABC News, Geneva.
But as the president leaves the Middle East, he leaves a region more in ferment than ever because of the Gulf crisis. And even though he found the situation satisfactory on the ground today, there is no reason to assume that it will work to the president's favor indefinitely. Okay, we haven't got things quite sorted out technically in London, so we'll be back in just a moment.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Brought to you by Citibank.
Syria, and when we get the bugs ironed out, we will come to that. It comes as no surprise that President Bush's meeting with the Syrian President Hafez al-Assad has provoked dismay in Israel. The Israeli Foreign Minister Moshe Aaron says that his country doesn't feel there is such a big difference between Assad and Saddam Hussein. Here we see another example of strain in the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Two old friends who have become increasingly suspicious of one another. Here's ABC's Dean Reynolds.
The Israeli military is on alert and ready to act. It has been for almost 4 months, staying obediently on the sidelines but growing increasingly worried that the Americans are leaving Israel in the dark about war plans in the Gulf.
They say, don't worry, we shall give you the right information in the right time. You'll get it, provided we shall interpret it first, and we shall decide what is for you and what is not for you.
The Israelis have made it clear that if at some point they believe Iraq is about to attack them, they will act. It would be smart, they say privately, for Washington to share some plans. If the U.S. and Israel went to war without advanced coordination, without dividing responsibilities, Israelis fear that their planes and those of the U.S. could find themselves heading for the same Iraqi targets, each jamming the other's communications. They could inadvertently interfere with each other's missiles, duplicate bombing runs, or possibly even shoot each other down. The Israelis are also disappointed by the U.S. refusal to share instantaneous satellite photos that might show an Iraqi attack in the works.
If the satellite sees it and Israel gets it only 24 hours later, goodbye.
The problem is that while Washington and Israel are allies, they have different views of how this crisis should end. President Bush talks only about getting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. But Israeli leaders insist Hussein must be removed from power and his military might destroyed. In this standoff with Iraq, there is U.S. concern that Israel could misinterpret raw satellite photos identifying a ground fire, say, as a missile launch and mistakenly order an attack. Or that hawkish Israeli officials could leak sensitive information, hoping it would build public support for military action. Finally, sharing war plans and the kind of sensitive intelligence Israel wants would tend to loosen America's overall control of the Gulf situation. Neither side likes to say so, but it all boils down to a question of trust. Dean Reynolds, ABC News, Tel Aviv.
Well, as you have seen this week in Europe and in the Middle East, the president has been working hard to manage the anti-Iraqi coalition. In Egypt and in Syria, he has ups and he has downs. So far, it has been good for Egypt. The U.S. and other nations have been financially generous, easing the pressure on a country which has a $50 billion foreign debt. New money from the Gulf states is helping Egypt to pay for wheat. In this country, the word for bread, aish, means life. Egypt produces some oil. Higher oil prices have been good for the economy. Many Egyptians who fled Kuwait have been absorbed back into their villages, at least for now. But there are dark clouds on the horizon. Up until now, the Egyptian troops in Saudi Arabia have been regarded as protecting the Muslim holy places against Saddam Hussein. But because the U.S. has become such a massive presence in the Gulf, some Egyptians now believe that because the U.S. helped with Egypt's debt, Mubarak is too enthusiastic about welcoming the U.S. military into the Arab homeland.
Egypt is 52 million. Egypt cannot survive without living elsewhere in the Arab world. So these issues make it imperative that Egypt be in good relations with the Arab world at large.
The idea of actually going to war even against Iraq is unthinkable to many Egyptians. For one thing, there are almost 1 million Egyptians who live and work in Iraq, and they would be in danger. So if there was a war against Iraq, Egypt would be attacking other Egyptians?
Yes, simply.
This is not possible in your view?
Not possible.
So here in Egypt, the real concern is the prospect of actually going to war in the Persian Gulf. Until now, it's been fairly simple. Egypt provides military security to Saudi Arabia, and in return gets a measure of economic security, which is badly needed. The consequences of actual fighting, however, are so much more unpredictable. There are even darker clouds over Syria. When Syria's President Assad sent troops to Saudi Arabia to join the American-led alliance against Iraq, a great many Syrians had a very hard time understanding why. Even though Syrian-Iraqi animosity is legendary, Syrians have been told for years that it is the U.S. and American support of Israel which has been the root of all Syria's troubles. Discontent is reported to have reached into the Syrian army itself. President Assad sits down with George Bush to emphasize his country's importance in the Middle East, but his critics at home say he is getting nothing out of it, that even as Assad commits in the Gulf, the U.S. is giving Israel, Syria's absolute enemy, the means to increase its military strength. And so the following things have begun to happen. The Syrian press, controlled by Assad, has begun to accuse the U.S. of using the Gulf crisis to change the Middle East in Israel's favor. Assad has said that Syrian troops will not attack Iraq. So tonight in Damascus, but also in Cairo, millions of Arabs are looking for an answer to this question. How determined is George Bush to move Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait by force? And what are the consequences for them if Bush tries?